In a museum drawer in Wyoming, sitting forgotten for decades, was a small piece of carved bone. It was labeled gaming piece, unknown use, and shelved. No one paid it any attention. But in April of 2026, one researcher picked it up, ran a new test on it, and realized he was holding the oldest dice ever found on planet Earth. Not from Egypt, not from Mesopotamia, from America. And it was 12,000 years old. That single piece of bone just rewrote a story we believed for over 100 years. The history books were clear. Dice Targworthy, the first objects humans ever made to gamble, to bet, to leave a choice to pure chance, were invented in the ancient cities of the Old World, around 5,500 years ago. That was settled fact. It was wrong by 6,000 years. And the people who actually made the first dice weren't kings or priests behind city walls. They were Ice Age hunters chasing giant bison across a frozen American continent at the end of the last glacial age. No cities, no writing, no farms, yet somehow they were gambling 6,000 years before anyone else on the planet. So how did the oldest gambling tools in human history end up ignored in a museum drawer, while the credit went to the wrong civilization for a century? And what does it tell us about the people who made them? To feel how strange this is, you have to understand what a die really is. Forget the little cube with dots. At its heart, a die is the first object a human ever built for one purpose: to create an outcome no one can control. You roll it, and your fate leaves your hands. That's the whole point. And for over 100 years, scientists believed only an advanced society could even think that way. You needed cities. Writing. Organized religion. The idea that a band of Ice Age hunter-gatherers fighting every single day just to survive could invent that same concept seemed impossible. That impossible thing just turned up in the dirt of Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. The discovery came from a study published in American Antiquity, one of the most respected archaeology journals in the world. And the man behind it, Robert J. Madden, a PhD student at Colorado State University, didn't find these dice by digging a new hole in the ground. He found them by re-examining things we'd already dug up. For decades, small flat pieces of carved bone had been turning up at ancient sites across the American West. And every time, archaeologists wrote the same vague note: possible gaming piece. Worked bone, function unknown. Then into a drawer it went. Nobody saw the pattern, because nobody had a way to see it. So Madden built one. A strict, scientific checklist for what actually counts as a die versus a random scrap of bone. And he didn't invent those rules from nothing. He built them on the work of Stuart Coolin, an ethnographer who in 1907 documented 293 sets of real Native American dice games in extraordinary detail. Actual games, played by actual people with real rules. Madden turned that century-old knowledge into a precise tool, a way to look at an ancient bone and ask, with rigor, toy, or accident, game or junk. Then he applied it to the collections at the Smithsonian Institution, the University of Wyoming, and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And the floodgates opened. He didn't find one die. He didn't find 10. He identified more than 600, scattered across 57 archaeological sites, spread over a 12-state region, covering nearly the entire span of North American prehistory. This was no fluke. This was an unbroken tradition of gambling that ran for over 100 centuries. But it was the oldest pieces that stopped everyone cold. The earliest dice date back roughly 12,800 to 12,200 years ago, and they belong to one specific group, a name that carries real weight in American archaeology. The Folsom culture, the legendary big game hunters of the Ice Age plains. Once you understand who these people were, the discovery becomes almost unbelievable. The Folsom people lived in a world that would terrify most of us. The last ice age was still fading. Glaciers gripped the north. The plains were ruled by enormous animals. Ancient bison, far bigger than any buffalo alive today, moving in massive herds across a cold, open land. And the Folsom hunters survived by outsmarting them. At a site called Agate Basin in Wyoming that drove these giants into steep, dead-end creek beds. Narrow arroyos where a trapped animal would panic, turn, and have nowhere to run. Then the hunters struck, armed with stone weapons so finely made that archaeologists still marvel at them today. These were desperate, primitive people. They were master craftsmen who knew their brutal world with the precision of people who couldn't afford a single mistake. In the middle of all that danger, the cold, the hunger, the hunt, They made time to do something else entirely. They sat down and gambled. And those dice are now the oldest on Earth. So what did they actually look like? Not the cubes you know. These were called binary lots, two-sided pieces, carved from bone, small and flat, oval or rectangular, shaped to fit in the hand and be tossed. Each piece had two faces. One side was marked by color, by texture, by a carved design. The other was left plain, exactly like the heads and tails of a coin. You'd throw a handful at once onto the ground, and your result depended on how many landed marked side up. Simple. But look closer at what that is. It's random. It's repeatable. And it has rules. These hunters weren't just tossing bones for fun. They were deliberately building randomness and then betting on it. And here's the quiet genius inside that. Throw enough pieces, enough times, and patterns appear. The odds balance out. That is the law of large numbers, one of the cornerstones of all probability. And these Ice Age people were leaning on it 12,000 years before any mathematician would ever write it down. These weren't accidents of bone working. They were made for one reason only, to generate chance. Simple, elegant tools, carrying one of the biggest ideas in human history. Because dice are humanity's first real handshake with randomness, the seed of probability, the ancestor of statistics, of risk, of insurance, of scientific reasoning itself. And we were taught that whole road began in the old world, just 5,500 years ago. To see how big that gap truly is, look at what the old record actually was. The dice everyone credited as the first came from places like Mesopotamia and the royal tombs of the ancient Near East. Small bone and stone pieces buried alongside board games for kings. Ivory dice were even found tucked inside the tomb of Tutankhamun. For generations, that was the official starting line of human gambling, a privilege of the great empires. But the Folsom dice predate Tutankhamun by nearly 10,000 years. They predate the first city in Mesopotamia. They predate writing, the wheel, and farming itself. While the old world's oldest dice were being placed in royal graves, the real first dice had already been rolled, lost, and buried under American soil for 6,000 years. Now Madden is careful here, and so should we be. He's not claiming Folsom hunters were doing math by the fire, or scratching out equations. But what they were doing matters just as much, creating chance, watching it, and trusting it, over and over, inside real games with real rules. They lived inside the logic of probability long before it had a name. And if it seems impossible that we could overlook something this enormous, sitting right under our noses, then you should know this is the second time the Folsom people have forced the experts to eat their words. Rewind to 1908. A cowboy named George McJunkin, a former slave who had taught himself geology and bone hunting, spotted giant ancient bison bones in a washed-out gully near Folsom, New Mexico. He was certain they were far older than science admitted was possible in America. For years, nobody listened. The consensus of the day insisted humans had only been on the continent a few thousand years. McJunkin died before he was ever proven right. But when archaeologists finally excavated that gully, they found a stone spear point lodged directly between the ribs of an extinct Ice Age bison. Undeniable proof that humans had been hunting here at the end of the last Ice Age, thousands of years earlier than the textbooks allowed. That single point shattered the timeline of an entire continent and gave the Folsom culture its name. So once, these people proved humans were even here in the Ice Age. Now, a century later, they've proven those same humans invented the first tools of chance on Earth. Both times, the evidence was simply waiting for someone willing to look. And the most surprising part of the whole story isn't how they made dice, it's why. And the answer has almost nothing to do with games. For ancient Native Americans, dice created something powerful, neutral ground. Picture two bands of people meeting out on the open plains, strangers, maybe even rivals. How do you build trust with someone who could be a threat? How do you trade, share news, form an alliance, without violence breaking out? You play. A game of chance gave everyone the exact same odds. It leveled the ground instantly. Under shared rules with an outcome nobody could rig, people from completely different worlds could sit down together, trade goods, exchange information, form bonds, and manage the constant uncertainty of a hard and dangerous life. The dice weren't toys. They were social technology, tools that held human communities together. And the scale proves it ran deep. This wasn't one tribe in one valley. Wildly different cultures, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, kept making the same object for the same purpose. Again and again, from the Ice Age hunters of Wyoming all the way to the games Stuart Coolin watched in the early 1900s. One unbroken thread of human connection, stretching across more than 100 centuries. And it all started with a few pieces of carved bone tossed onto the frozen ground of a continent the old world didn't even know was there. For over 100 years, we told ourselves that sophistication had a single home, that the great leaps of the human mind flowed outward from a handful of old world empires, and that Ice Age hunters were too busy surviving to bother with anything as abstract as chance and risk. This discovery quietly tears that idea apart. In one of the harshest worlds humanity has ever faced, surrounded by giant beasts and dying glaciers, these people found the time and the mind to invent the first tools of chance on Earth. And they did it 6,000 years before anyone else. But that leaves one last question hanging in the air. If something this important could hide in plain sight for this long, mislabeled, overlooked, forgotten, then what are we missing right now? How many more world-changing truths about our ancestors are sitting in drawers at this very moment, waiting for the right eyes, the right test, the right question? The first dice were rolled 12,000 years ago in the cold heart of America, and the human story, it seems, is still hiding secrets we've only just begun to uncover. Thanks for watching. If this discovery fascinated you, give the video a like, subscribe, and drop a comment with your thoughts. Share it with a fellow history lover, and until the next discovery, stay curious.